Y'all ready? The first thing I'd like to do is have our hosts introduce any guests they may have. And let's start with this table right over here. Yes?
Mr. Steve Hurt from Flemingburg, Kentucky.
Wow, Flemingburg. Nice to see you. Welcome. Welcome. Thank you. Okay. Let's go back to the table right there, right by here. Yeah. You. Everyone's looking around. Anybody there have a guess? Ernie? Anyone? Okay. The table behind them. Yes. None there. Okay. How about the back? Yes, sir. I can't hear you.
I'm happy to have my wife at this tonight.
Well, his wife. We're happy to have her here. Okay, Chris.
I'm happy to have my wife, Susan.
Hey, for that matter, I got my wife here too. Why don't you stand up?
Not today, I'm different.
All right. Okay, next table. Anyone? How about here? Anyone? Okay, let's go back here. Anyone? Way in the back. Okay, let's start here.
Lexington, Dan Yates, Lexington.
Welcome, Dan. You all have anyone to introduce?
We do.
All right.
I've been a member for years. It's the first time I got to
Your husband. Well, that's a one-up, isn't it? Yes, sir.
I had the pleasure of bringing Tom Merritt. He's a former member and soon to be a new member again.
Very good, very good. We like that. The far table there. Anyone? And then right over here. Yes. Hi.
Is Ernie Price. He is with the National Park Service. Has worked at several different locations within the Park Service, including at Academic Courthouse. Currently the superintendent at Penn National Model.
Very good. Ernie, it's good to have you here. Really is. And by the way, it's a great place for you all to go on a nice, pretty weekend. Camp Nelson has really, they've done a lot over there, and it's a very interesting place to see. Anything here? Okay, well listen, thank you all, and the guests, we're delighted to have you and hope that you can become members. Yes, we have one more. Okay, good. I'm glad to have you all here, guys. Thank you, Jim. Okay, why don't we hear from our secretary, Bill?
Thanks, Steve.
Sure.
Good evening. I want to mention the new members we have. We have some I'm going to recognize. Kevin Tudor, who I understand may not be here with us tonight. Prentice Harvey. I think Prentice is here. Would you please stand, Prentice? And a culture of applause. We got one more new member, couples member, Daniel and Jessica Parton. Would you all please stand? Well, there's at least one. As most of you are aware, we lost an icon of this organization for history in Kentucky since the last meeting. And I'm talking about Dr. Charles Rowland. I would ask for a moment of silence. Thank you. Kent may have more on him later, but I got to know him through my mother, always at the University of Kentucky Press. We have 210 members, and we're always looking for more. So, keep your eye on the lookout for people that might be interested in our subject and steering our our way. Now, since the last meeting, we have had nominations for the board of directors. And we've had 3 people, and I'm going to mention them: Alan Denny, Larry Diener, and Tom Sabat. And I would like to have them elected by acclamation. And we're always looking for other new members, and if you have for the board, and if you know of somebody, see one of the officers, Chris, me, or Ken. So, but those 3 are now on our board by acclamation. So you will be hearing from us for the next meeting.
Very good, very good. All right, and now let's hear from our treasurer. Chris? Here it comes.
Good evening. Nice to see everybody. Beautiful evening. We've got a great speaker. We've got a great speaker for you tonight. Once I figure out how this works. Usually I have a bow tie on tonight, so I don't need the bow. Here we go. First thing I want to mention is our upcoming cemetery tour, which is a week from Saturday at the Lexington Cemetery. And Ken will be leading it. We're going to meet at 9 o'clock at the Henry Clay Monument. And the admission is $20, cash, no checks, please. We'll have a table set up there at the monument, and we'll try to conclude the tour at noon, but it's a fascinating history lesson on Lexington's very famous members of our history that you'll learn about. So I encourage you, if you haven't come, and bring guests. We'd love to have whoever can come. Just wanted to remind everybody of our reservation policy. We do have to turn in our head count on Wednesday before the meetings on the following Monday. So that's at 4 o'clock. We do have a few that sometimes try to call us over the weekend and that type of thing, and it makes it tough because we have to kind of manage who gets to eat. And if you want to be one of those that's told, hey, we're out of food, that's because we didn't count right and we didn't count you right in your reservation. So also, if you want to cancel your reservation, which we understand, and get a refund, you have to do so by Wednesday of the week before, Wednesday before the meeting. I know it's a little bit of an inconvenience to do that. We don't make that policy. This is the hotel, and they do that because they need to have advance notice on how many we're going to be here to order food and that type of thing. Speaking of the food, I thought it was pretty good tonight. Y'all did enjoy it. And it has been good. We've kept the price down. Ken and I have negotiated with the hotel. They've been very gracious, but the grace period is over. So next year we'll probably be looking at a price increase. We don't know how much.
We'll keep it down.
But we'll do the best we can. So, but we can have hot dogs. We get some meat. If that's okay with everybody. Bill mentioned new members. I have new member applications. In March of 20, we had over 300 members in this organization. So we've lost about 100 members in the 2 years. So we're really looking to recruit younger members. Bring your spouse, significant other as a guest. That'd be great. We had a good crowd tonight. This is one of the best crowds we've had. So encourage everybody to come back. And then I have membership applications in the back. Thank you.
All right. You heard about, and of course we all know about Charlie Rowland passing away. Charlie was just a dear friend, and my wife and I would go out and visit him as often as we possibly could. And we watched him slowly go down and to the point where he lay in bed and never talked. And I can remember this was about 6 days before he passed away. We sat by his bedside. tried to do some small talk with him to no avail. I mentioned to him, I said, Charlie, I just came back from Virginia Tech, where I spoke at Bud Robertson's old spring meeting, and still no response. And I said, you know, Charlie, how much Bud loved Stonewall Jackson. And with that, this smile came on his face, and he went, Stonewall, and shook his head. It was the sweetest thing I ever saw in my life, and it shows you what drove Charlie Rowland. The Stonewall, the Civil War in general, you bring it up and he's just electric, but that was as close as far as he could get it. And but a sweet man, and he was our president for 10 years, and those were great years, and for those of you who remember them. One of many people coming from the university who contributed mightily to this roundtable. Well, to introduce our speaker tonight, Gary Gallagher, really, for those of you who love the Civil War and keep up with Civil War literature, he needs no introduction here. He has been a speaker here before, but just a little bit about his background. Gary is the John L. Now III Professor of History of the American Civil War at the University of Virginia, Emeritus. He taught at Penn State University for 12 years before joining the faculty of the University of Virginia in 1998. He is the author or editor of more than 40 books, including The Confederate War that Harvard University Press published, Lee and His Generals in War and Memory, published by Louisiana State University Press, Causes Won, Lost, and Forgotten, How Hollywood and Popular Art Shaped What We Know About the Civil War, at the University of North Carolina Press, and The Union War, again a Harvard Press publication, and The Enduring Civil War Reflections on the Great American Crisis, published by LSU. Gary has participated in more than 6 television projects during his career as a professor of history. He was the recipient of the Cavaliers Distinguished Teaching Professorship for 2010 to 2012. That's the highest award conveyed by the University of Virginia. He is the recipient of the Philip Merrill Award for outstanding contributions to the liberal arts education from the American Council of Trustees and Alumni in 2013. He's been active in the field of preservation. He, interestingly, was the first president of the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites. And that's the organization, that's the forerunner of the Civil War, or now the American Battlefield Trust. He's been on television many times, on documentaries about the American Civil War, and has given testimony about it before Congress on numerous occasions. He's got a big resume, folks, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome back to the Kentucky Civil War Roundtable my old friend Gary Gallagher.
I'm going to switch microphones here. Is this one working right? Can everybody hear this? That's good news. I thought a lot about Charlie Rowland before. I drove over from Charlottesville this morning, got up early, and got here in about 6 hours. No traffic on 64. I spoke here many times when Charlie was president, and have such fond memories of him and many other people who are in this group. One of my favorite memories of Charlie was being at a conference with him in Sarasota, Florida in the late 1990s, and after a long day, a number of us got together and were smoking some cigars out by the beach, and Charlie, after about 20 minutes, held his cigar up against a light so we could all see it, and he said, "I hate to report that my cigar is suffering from an asymmetrical ash." Which is a sort of classic Charlie Rowland line, and I'll stop with that, but we're talking a little bit about Charlie, and that's what I'm going to say. I'm also going to get glasses on. I'm right in between needing glasses and not needing glasses, so nothing is going to quite work right, but I have a fighting chance if I put these on. I'm going to talk tonight about U.S. Grant and R.E. Lee during the Overland campaign of 1864. And what I'm most interested in is what reactions at the time were to both of them, both in the United States and in the Confederacy, and also among people looking toward our war from abroad. And by abroad, I mean London and Paris, the only two places that really mattered to the people who were wandering around here then. I want to look at how that campaign was perceived by the people who observed it in real time and thought about it then. Lee and Grant occupied singular positions by the spring of 1864. The two of them were the leading popular symbols of their respective causes. And between the opening of the Overland campaign, I'm going to define the Overland campaign as from the Battle of the Wilderness starting on May 5th. I take it through the assaults at Petersburg on June 15th to 18th. Many people lump that in with the siege. That's not the siege. I think that's the end of the Overland campaign. That's the period I'm talking about. And in that period, newspaper editors and Union and Confederate soldiers and civilians, foreign observers, all had something to say about what was going on in Virginia. I know there's always a hot debate about what theater is most important, Eastern Theater, Western Theater. There are even a few really sad people who think the Trans-Mississippi Theater was perhaps the most important. It's the Eastern Theater. It's the most important. It gets the most attention. It's where the two most important generals were, the two most famous armies were, the two capitals were there. And this was a riveting campaign that was going to unfold between the two main guys on each side, one from each side, who are finally going to be going up against one another. The contrast in opinions that this campaign elicited, with Grant subjected to far harsher treatment than Lee, illuminates the different political environments in the two nations, the impact of previous campaigns on civilian expectations and perceptions, and the nature of the commander's pre-1864 operations. I think it's very telling that both Lee and Grant were compared to George Washington by the people at the time. Nobody is compared to George Washington. Jorge is all by himself on the pyramid of great Americans at this point. He is seen as the absolute perfect representative of small r Republican selflessness, somebody who had great power and then gave it up twice. He gave it up at the end of the Revolution. He gave it up again at the end of his second term in office. So he is not Julius Caesar, and he's not Napoleon. He is someone who behaves the way you're supposed to behave in a republic. You go forth, you do your duty, you go back, and you give up power. The fact that both Lee and Grant were compared to Washington is very telling. Abraham Lincoln had a little not quite a celebration, but an event on March 9th, 1864, where he conveyed the rank of Lieutenant General to U.S. Grant with just a few words. No, Congress had said no one else would ever hold the rank of Lieutenant General again after Washington had held it. There's only one Washington. We'll never. Why do commanders of United States armies only have the rank of Major General? Because nobody else was going to have Washington's rank. Grant got it. That's very telling. Lee was often compared to Washington in the Confederacy. I'll give you just two quotations here, one from December 1862. This is an Atlanta newspaper. Like Washington, he possesses in an eminent degree those qualities which are indispensable in the great leader and champion upon whom the country rests its hope for present success and our future independence. 2 years later, in March of '64, the Richmond Daily Dispatch said that Lee was closer in resemblance to George Washington than we had supposed humanity would ever again furnish. Washington, it's really telling that these two people are compared to Washington. Well, the presence of these two commanders there on the Rapidan-Rappahannock River line in the spring of 1864 meant that there was going to be tremendous anticipation on both sides of the Potomac and the Ohio rivers about how this was going to unfold. People in the United States relished the thought that finally they had a man in charge who was going to crush Lee, whose reputation had suffered almost not at all by the defeat at Gettysburg. This is a fascinating thing to me. Gettysburg had no effect, basically, on Lee's reputation, either in the Confederacy or in the United States. He remained the principal bogeyman to the loyal American citizenry. The New York Herald said that Grant is a soldier who will not be McClellanized. That would be a microaggression for George B. McClellan to use his name that way. But it's just shorthand for, in other words, you're going to do a good job instead of a bad job. His object is to crush the main armies of Jeff Davis, and first of all, the rebel army of Virginia, which is the life and soul of the rebellion. For their part, Confederates commented about Grant's superiority in manpower. Of course he has more men, that goes without saying, but they didn't think that Grant would prevail against Lee. I'll quote Charles Minor Blackford, who was a captain. He served in James Longstreet's First Corps. He wrote to his wife on the eve of the Overland campaign. He said, "Their army's twice as large as ours, but General Lee's officers and men are confident of success." Many Confederates deprecated Grant's Western triumphs. Toward the end of March, one of the Richmond papers attributed Grant's success in the Western theater, quote, to overwhelming numbers and the weakness and imbecility of our own resistance. And in mid-April, that same paper assured readers that Grant's performances bear no comparison whatsoever to those of General Lee. Lieutenant Colonel Walter H. Taylor of Lee's staff, he's the guy closer to Lee for the whole war than anyone else. He similarly insisted that Grant enjoyed an inflated reputation. I can't really see this table over here. I'm going to have to move around. I'm not ignoring you. I just can't see you. You're on my mind constantly. Walter Taylor said that Grant had an inflated reputation. He said, "He will find, I trust, that General Lee is a very different man to deal with, and if I mistake not, will shortly come to grief if he attempts to repeat the tactics in Virginia which proved so successful in Mississippi." Beginning in early May, the armies bludgeoned one another. We know this in this unbelievable bloodletting that played out over a period of between 6 and 7 weeks, depending upon exactly how we look at it. I want to spend a little time with casualties, but casualties always are a central part of how people judge Lee and Grant in this campaign. I'm going to round the numbers off to the nearest 500, and I think these will help give us a little bit of context for what I'm going to say as I go forward. During the course of this 6-week campaign, Grant fielded 167,000 soldiers, Lee 96,000 soldiers. That's their opening strengths plus the reinforcements that they got in the course of the campaign. 167 to 96, which means Confederates mustered just more than 57% of their opponent's strength. U.S. forces suffered nearly 65,000 casualties, 54,500 killed or wounded, and more than 10,000 captured or missing. Confederates lost 34,500, 23,500 of whom were killed or wounded, and 11,000 missing or captured. Grant's casualties were not quite 40% of his 167,000 men. Lee's casualties were just short of 36% of his 96,000. So Grant had an overall loss about double what the Confederates were, and he also had a little bit higher percentage loss in his army. Now, it's become a commonplace that unprecedented carnage marked the Army's track from the Rapidan River to the outskirts of Petersburg. Similarly, Grant's willingness to accept huge casualties to gain victory has colored many comparative estimates of the two great antagonists, and that the number of federal casualties often put forward both then and now as proof that Grant was a butcher. That tag got fastened on Grant in the midst of the Overland campaign, especially by the Democratic press. I'll talk about that in just a minute. I think both of these subjects, both the notion that this is unprecedented loss and the fact that Grant accepted these casualties, need a little bit more attention. And I'll start with the scale of casualties. The Overland campaign figured differently. The scale figured differently for the Army of the Potomac than it did for the Army of Northern Virginia. For the Army of the Potomac, it did represent a significant departure. Losses in the Army's major campaigns prior to the spring of 1864, the Army of the Potomac's major campaigns, that is from the Peninsula Campaign in 1862 down through Mine Run in late 1863, totaled 118,000, more than a third of which came at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg in a period of 9 weeks. In several campaigns, significant parts of the Army of the Potomac saw very little action. For example, the 1st and 5th Corps lost 1,000 men between them at Chancellorsville, and the 6th Corps, as we all know, lost almost no troops at Gettysburg, fewer than 250 at Gettysburg. It's the biggest corps at Gettysburg, suffers almost no casualties there. In 45 days under Grant, casualties soared to 55% of this entire total for the preceding 25 months. 55% of the 25 months in this one campaign. To put that in perspective, I think it's important to step back and look at Grant in the Western theater. His overall career had not featured huge losses. In all of his great victories in the West, from Belmont, which wasn't a great victory, but from Henry and Donelson to Shiloh to Vicksburg to Chattanooga, Grant's total casualties, 35,000. 35,000 in all those great campaigns. The Confederate ledger tells a different story. Before Grant arrived, the Army in Northern Virginia had suffered 102,500 casualties. That's subtract 10,500 of those that took place on the peninsula before Lee took charge. So with Lee in command, you get the residue of that. Lee's losses against Grant between May 5th and June 18th numbered almost exactly 1/3 of that previous number, a much smaller percentage than in the Army of the Potomac. In other words, the Overland campaign on the Confederate side represented a heavy but scarcely unprecedented level of loss. The Army of Northern Virginia was a force that, unlike its opponent, never had experienced the luxury of waging a battle without virtually full commitment of its manpower. Lee always commanded fewer men than his federal opponents. We all know that. Only at the 7 days is it basically an even fight, about 90,000 on each side. But even though he commanded far fewer men, his losses approached 87% of the Union losses, 87%. Lee's 92,000 pre-Overland campaign casualties should be set beside Grant's 35,000 pre-Overland campaign casualties. Divided into different periods, the pre-Overland campaign, and I'm about finished throwing numbers at you, just hang on for a minute and the storm will pass. Divided into different periods, the pre-Overland campaign Confederate casualties offer a very interesting comparison to the 34,500 Overland campaign casualties that Lee suffered. 7 days through Chantilly, that's 9 weeks, 30,500 casualties. 7 days through Antietam, that's 11 weeks, 43,500. Chancellorsville through Gettysburg, 8 weeks, 40,500. By the spring of 1864, in sum, Confederates inside and outside the Army had come to expect massive losses, something that must be factored into the price of R.E. Lee's leadership. R.E. Lee is a tremendously gifted soldier. He's also the bloodiest Army commander in United States history if your gauge is the percentage of his men who get shot. If you're a soldier in the Army in Northern Virginia, you have the highest percentage chance of being shot of any Army in United States history. Joe Glatar's very careful study of the Army tells us that if you're one of Lee's men, you have a 73% chance of becoming a casualty. 73%. Grant isn't even within shouting distance of that in terms of casualties. Lee's the bloodiest. If there is a butcher, if we're going to fasten that tag on somebody, it isn't Grant who should get the tag, it's R.E. Lee. What's fascinating to me is that these losses did nothing to undercut Lee's reputation in the Confederacy. He's the man in the Confederacy. The Confederates accepted these casualties as part of the price of having R.E. Lee as your most important general. Behind the lines in the United States, the Overland campaign put faith in Grant to a severe test. Politics in a two-party system certainly came into play. Democrats proved far more willing than Republicans to criticize Grant, and the Copperhead wing of the Democratic Party, the peace wing of the Democratic Party, mounted a no-holds-barred assault on the new general-in-chief as part of their effort to discredit the Lincoln administration. The upcoming presidential election intensified partisan reaction to casualties in the United States, and the fact that the Republican National Convention took place right toward the end of the Overland campaign, right after the Battle of Cold Harbor, upped the ante in terms of how people were looking at casualties. The Democrats once again used them. Before the Battle of Cold Harbor on June 3rd, some Copperheads, this is before Cold Harbor, some Copperheads already had decried Grant as a butcher, responsible for piling up casualties at an absolutely unacceptable rate. And overall, much of the North gave up on hopes of quick victory and accepted the prospect of a siege as the only way that was going to bring victory over the Confederacy. And the problem with that is that it would take a long time, and maybe a very long time. And they had hoped for a quick, they hoped that when Grant took the field, he would knock Lee out quickly. Let me take a few minutes each to look at how the press looked at Grant, how the soldiers looked at Grant, and then how Lincoln did as a result of the Overland campaign. The press generally stayed behind him. Am I getting feedback from two mics here? Let me get rid of that one. Mostly this press stayed behind him. And I'll quote from just 2 or 3 papers here. I'll quote from Harper's Weekly, which offered a short piece that applauded the fact that Grant didn't try to hide how high his casualties had been. Harper's Weekly had a circulation of about 100,000. It was a huge circulation for the time. Great and difficult as the task is, there is a public tranquility which springs from profound confidence in General Grant and in the ultimate success of our cause. Yes, the casualties are high, but we're going to win. Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. Greeley is a Republican at this point. Horace Greeley's whatever he feels like being, as many of you know, and he felt like being many things in the course of his life. He applauded Grant's tenacity and urged everyone in the United States to try to match Grant's determination. The Tribune's treatment of Cold Harbor reveals how the partisan press functions like our press does now. People who pretend to be journalists but really aren't. They're either shilling for one party or the other. That's what we have as a press now. That's what we had as a press in the 19th century. They just didn't pretend that isn't what we had as a press then. That's the interesting thing. This is how they treated Cold Harbor in the New York Tribune. It was an awful repulse. We know that. The Tribune said nothing decisive came out of the battle. To some extent, it was a success. General Grant goes steadily toward Richmond, and his army finds encouragement in every step of progress. To describe Cold Harbor as to some extent a success is hallucinogenic, of course, but anyway, that's what's going on there. Most other Republican newspapers fell in line. I'll quote from Joseph Medill's Chicago Tribune. It, in effect, issued a challenge to its Republican readers. General Grant's operations are making good progress. There's no occasion for disheartenment. And if you are disappointed that the end is not more nearly reached, the blame is on you, not on anything that Grant was doing. Like many other Republican papers, the New York Times tried to finesse Cold Harbor. It wrote, if Lee allows himself to be shut up within Richmond, the problem reduces itself to a repetition of Vicksburg. Again, in other words, another success for U.S. Grant. The Democratic press divided over Grant's conduct during the Overland campaign. The New York Herald, which had the widest circulation of any of the Democratic papers, was generally favorable to him, talked about his extraordinary genius, said he was the most consummate general of the age. But even the New York Herald, in the end, trying to be upbeat, had a hard time after Cold Harbor and said that our hopes for the fall of Richmond must be relinquished. It's not going to fall quickly. We just have to come to terms with that. The image of Grant as a butcher arose in and remained confined to the Copperhead wing of the Democratic Party. And the origins of this charge had everything to do with politics and very little to do with the Overland campaign, actually. Well before the scale of fighting had become well known, the Copperheads were already assailing Grant as a butcher. I'm just going to quote from one of the Copperhead journals. It was called The Old Guard, published in New York City and edited by a man named C. Chauncey Burr, B-U-R-R. In one bare-knuckled assault, Burr slammed Lincoln, the Republicans, and Grant in one brutal passage. What is the difference between a butcher, that's in italics, and a general, also in italics? A butcher kills animal for food. A general kills men to gratify the ambition or malice of politicians and scoundrels. Grant charged Burr is the death's head of a whole people. The Copperheads start the notion of Grant as a butcher. The Confederates pick it up very quickly, as we'll see in a minute. What about soldiers within the ranks? The Overland campaign undoubtedly took a grievous physical and mental toll on Grant's soldiers. The Overland campaign changes. It's a stark change from the past. In the past, the armies would maneuver, they would come to battle, one or the other of them would retreat, and there could be a significant period before there was another major battle. Sometimes there could be many after Gettysburg. You go from July of 64, from 63 to May of 64 before there's another major battle. The Overland campaign inaugurates this day-by-day, grinding, relentless kind of fighting that had not been seen before in the Civil War. And that kind of fighting took a special toll on the men. A majority in the Army of the Potomac shared feelings of loss, of course, over slain and maimed comrades, frustration at repeatedly being asked to assault entrenched Confederates, that's also new, and disappointment that the war promised to continue for many months. We've done all of this, we've incurred horrible casualties, we still can't see the end of the road. The fact that thousands of men whose 3-year enlistments ran out in May and June of 1864 refused to re-enlist attests to the weariness within the ranks of the Army of the Potomac. Yet from Cold Harbor through the end of July, most Federals also recognized that they had very significantly damaged the Army of Northern Virginia. And they believed that Grant, if he kept applying pressure, probably would end up bringing victory to the United States. I'm just going to quote from 3 accounts. These are well-known accounts, easily accessible. Many of you have probably already read them. One is Charles S. Wainwright, who's an artillery officer in the 5th Corps. He noted the widespread disillusionment with these frontal assaults against entrenched Confederates. Whoever was responsible for the extended mode of attack, he wrote the day after the fighting at Cold Harbor on June 3rd, is getting no military credit nor the love of the men who are being used up by it. Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Lyman of George Meade's staff famously quoted Corps Commander Gouverneur Kemble Warren of the 5th Corps. Warren wrote at one point, quote, "For 30 days now it has been one funeral procession past me, and it is too much." Lyman's own opinion, rendered in his journal on June 4th, was that, quote, "There's been too much assaulting during this campaign. Very soon the men will no longer charge entrenchments and will only go forward when driven by their officers." And that, in fact, happened in the assaults at Petersburg on June 15th to 18th. Many of the veteran Union regiments simply refused to attack. Many of the big, heavy artillery units that had been brought out of the defenses of Washington went ahead and attacked and were butchered, took some of the heaviest casualties of the whole war at that point. The last person I'll quote is Robert McAllister, who commanded the 11th New Jersey Infantry of the 2nd Corps. He termed the area of operations, quote, "one vast graveyard. Graves everywhere, marking the track of the Army." He saw the future as work by sieging, as he put it, but he said we will still have to charge sometimes, but he had faith in Grant despite all of this. He said he understands his business and will eventually succeed. Everyone has confidence in him. I don't think everyone did, but I think most of the soldiers probably did. Grant never forged a bond with the men of the Army of the Potomac like the bond that Lee had with the Army of Northern Virginia. Not even close. Not even close. He began the campaign a stranger to them, and he never earned their unqualified affection. He did win respect, as first evidenced when the soldiers realized he would continue the offensive after the Battle of the Wilderness, and they cheered him. It's one of the most famous moments of the war, this great epiphany on May 7th, as the Federal troops get to the Brock Road. And they know when they get to the Brock Road that if they turn left, they're going back to the fords over the Rapidan and the Rappahannock, and the campaign is over, as it was under Joseph Hooker 1 year earlier. If they turn to the right and head towards Spotsylvania Courthouse, it's going to continue. And there are going to be more casualties, and a lot more of them are going to get shot. But if they turn to the right, that means the pressure is going to be continued on the rebels as it never had been before. And when the soldiers turned right there and saw U.S. Grant come up, they cheered him. not orchestrated, no officers telling them to do it. It was spontaneous. And it was a moment when they decided this guy is different. He is not the kind of officer we have had before. He's not George B. McClellan after the 7 days or Antietam. He's not Joseph Hooker, who was in a splendid position on May the 5th at Chancellorsville and gave it up and retreated. And he's not, and I hate to say this with Kent right in front of me because he has a soft spot in his heart for George Gordon Meade. He's also not George Gordon Meade, who let the Army of the Potomac get back across the Potomac in the wake of the campaign at Gettysburg. This guy's different, and that mattered to the soldiers in the Army of the Potomac, and yet they never bestowed a nickname on Grant like Marse Robert, which is an affectionate nickname, like Uncle Billy, as Sherman's soldiers did, an affectionate nickname, or Little Mac, as the longtime veterans of the Army of the Potomac called McClellan. They never did. Grant doesn't have a nickname like that bestowed by the soldiers. Nicknames mean everything in the Civil War. You can tell by a nickname an awful lot about anything with Uncle in it is good. Anything with old in it is good. Old Pete, Longstreet, Old Jube, Jubal Early. Anything with Granny in it is not good. Theophilus Holmes is Granny Holmes. That's not good. If your nickname is Old Brains, as Halleck's was, men probably aren't lining up to follow you into battle. Nicknames matter. Grant didn't get one from the soldiers in the Army of the Potomac. Frank Wilkeson, a gunner in a New York battle, recalled in his memoirs how many Federals specifically compared Grant to McClellan after the last attacks at Petersburg on the 18th of June, 1864. The general opinion among them was that Grant, had Grant been in command of the Army in 1862, the rebellion would have been crushed that year. Yet the common soldiers still held back with Grant, at least according to Wilkeson. The enlisted men felt and talked and lived in hopes long deferred, never fulfilled, of the coming of a great commander whose military talent would command our unqualified respect. He never came. That is Wilkeson's. Wilkeson is sort of a negative kind of guy, but that is a very interesting passage from him. Grant did have the confidence of the most important person in the United States. Lincoln became more and more and more enamored of Grant as the campaign went on. Overland, far from diminishing Lincoln's belief in Grant, the Overland campaign increased Lincoln's belief in Grant. He did hope, at least early on, that the great success might come a little more quickly than it did. It didn't come. He didn't give up on it. He went down to meet with Grant in Petersburg on June 21st and 22nd, back in Washington on the 23rd. When he got back, he reported, quote, "The Army in fine health, good position, good spirits, Grant quietly confident." And Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, who was a great observer and scribbled everything down in his big fat diary, said that he thought that Lincoln's time with Grant had left the president, in his words, in very good spirits. Lincoln is on board. Lincoln just wants to push things through to the end. Let me quote two foreign observers and their views of Grant here. And the first one is Lord Lyons, who was the ranking British diplomat in the United States. In early 1864, he sent a note to Lord John Russell, the British Foreign Secretary. He said the Confederates continue to baffle Grant's plan to cut off the Confederate capital from all communications, and by this means not only to reduce the city, but also to capture the whole of the army of General Lee. That failure, said Lord Lyons, meant that the confident hopes of the public have been succeeded in the United States, have been succeeded by despondency. The French consul in Richmond similarly kept his superiors in Paris informed of events in America. He wrote very detailed dispatches. He included one on June 11th that estimated, quote, around 100,000 men, Federals and Confederates, have been disabled in Virginia within the space of 1 month, without any real and decisive advantage that can be verified for either side. So long as the Confederates held Richmond, this Frenchman thought, Grant would be reckoned a failure. All right, what about the reaction to Lee? The French consul had included a passage in one of his cables back to, one of his messages back to Paris, not cables. The cable was briefly working before the war, then it was broken, put back in place after the war. He said in one of his dispatches back to Paris that Richmond was being ably and heroically defended by Lee and the Army in Northern Virginia. Those words were mirrored the overwhelming reaction in the Confederacy to Lee's performance. It's just a symphony of praise for the most part in the Confederacy regarding Lee. Newspapers almost universally, soldiers and civilian accounts strongly favorable. It's very hard to find negative things about Lee in the course of the Overland campaign. There are even a number of northern newspapers that had positive things to say about Lee in the course of the Overland campaign. This really aggravated Grant. This is not to say that every Confederate celebrated Lee. Surely that's not true. But the difference between responses to Lee and responses to Grant, very striking. Grant understood all this. He discussed it somewhat testily, I think, in his memoirs. To be extolled by the entire press of the South after every engagement, and by a portion of the press North with equal vehemence, wrote Grant of his opponent, was calculated to give him the entire confidence of his troops and to make him feared by his antagonists. General Lee was a very highly esteemed man in the Confederate Army and States, wrote Grant. Now, Grant's saying that it's the newspapers that made people really believe in Lee, misses the elephant in the room, which is victories and tremendous generalship is what really made Lee beloved in the Confederacy. But the newspapers were certainly on his side. I think two factors help explain the absence of much negative Confederate reaction to Lee in his operations against Grant. First, there's no two-party system in the Confederacy, which meant there was no institutional opposition to the Davis government equivalent to the Democratic Party in the United States, and especially nothing like the Copperhead movement to use criticism of Lee's actions to harm the president. Moreover, the Confederates were not in the midst of a major national election. Something, as I said earlier, raised the stakes in the United States for Lincoln and Grant. The Confederates, as you all know, decided early on they weren't going to have political parties. The founders didn't like political parties. We like the founders. We're not going to have political parties. So they didn't have formal political parties. They just had one group that hated Jefferson Davis and one group that didn't, and functioned sort of like political parties, but they didn't actually have political parties, and that made a difference in this regard. The second factor shielding Lee from criticism is that he entered the campaign, I've already said this, he entered the campaign with a towering reputation, built on almost 2 years of success at the head of his army. In the absence of good news from major armies and generals in other theaters, let's take a minute and list all the great victories that the Army of Tennessee won in the Civil War. Somebody shout out Chickamauga, and then I'll start talking again. I mean, it's not hard to figure out why people focused on the Army of Northern Virginia. If you're in the midst of a fight to establish a new nation, you're going to cling to things that are sort of good news. The good news emanates from the Army of Northern Virginia, especially in that unbelievable year between June 1862 and May 1863, the year when the Army of Northern Virginia is Lee and the next year is Jackson and Longstreet and Jeb Stuart. That's the year that really cements the Army of Northern Virginia in the minds of most Confederates as the most important national institution they have. That's what Lee is running on as he comes into the Overland campaign of 1864, and it is tremendously important. To a greater and greater degree, people focus on Lee and his army. That's where the good news is. Why is Appomattox the end of the war? There are scores of thousands of Confederates under arms all over the place after Lee surrenders at Appomattox, but Appomattox is the end because it's the end of Lee and his army. And that's how important Lee and his army had become. He had triumphed. Jefferson Davis wrote a fascinating letter to his brother, to his older brother, Joseph, in the wake of the Battle of Chancellorsville, where he's talking about how Lee had triumphed against double his numbers against Joseph Hooker. And he said that Lee, of course, is spectacular, but other Confederate commanders aren't behaving that way. We're not getting that out of anyone else. He said a general, and he underlined that, in the full acceptation of the word, is a rare product. Scarcely more than one can be expected in a generation, but in this mighty war, there is need for half a dozen. Jefferson Davis put his finger on one of the real problems the Confederacy had. We need a bunch of them. We have one. Unfortunately, we have more than one army that needs a commander. We've only got one guy who's really good at commanding an army. Well, that attitude was prevalent in all parts of the Confederacy, and it meant that Lee had nothing to prove, either to the citizenry of the Confederacy or to his men as he went into battle against Grant, whereas Grant, in a new position and a different arena, commanding soldiers unfamiliar with him, remained something of an unknown quantity who did have to prove himself in ways that Lee simply did not. I'll quote you just a couple of things that indicate how people reacted to Lee. I'll quote one from the Richmond Daily Dispatch. A sort of hagiographical piece came out on June 1, just before the major fighting at Cold Harbor. The confidence in Lee and his army is not confined to the ranks of that army and to our fellow citizens. There are few who do not feel it, and bless God when they acknowledge it, for sending us so great a general to lead so brave an army. That was a pro-Davis newspaper. The Charleston Mercury was an anti-Davis newspaper, but it consistently emphasized that Grant's numbers, however big they were, could not overcome Lee. Richmond was never safer, nor the Confederate cause on higher or firmer ground, wrote the Charleston Mercury. Grant had a 2-to-1 advantage. That's not enough to overcome, wrote the paper, the invincible army of Lee. Lee is described repeatedly by the press and individual Confederates as invincible and never defeated in the spring and summer of 1864. This is after Gettysburg. After Gettysburg, he's still described and treated this way. Confederate press readily embraced the image of Grant as a butcher, became a staple of their coverage of the Overland campaign, a really major theme. This allowed editors to create a sort of brutish foil for Lee and his gallant band of brothers. Here we have Lee and his sort of chivalric band, and here we have Grant, the kind of ruthless Yankee who does understand basic arithmetic, but that's all he understands, just pile his poor men in. One editor referred to Grant as the unfortunate butcher who persists despite the slaughter of his troops. And another one, in language that C. Chauncey Burr would have embraced, said, "There are butchers of humanity to whom the sight of their fellow creature's blood affords an intoxicating pleasure. Grant is one of those charming individuals." Nobody writes anything like that about Lee. Diaries and letters inside and outside the Army in Northern Virginia include a load of comparable evidence. I love to quote Catherine Ann Devereaux Edmonston, whose diary is titled Journal of a Secesh Lady. It's the best diary by any Confederate woman by far. It's just an absolute treasure trove. If you want a really good diary by a Confederate woman, get Kate Edmonston's diary. She wrote in her diary, scornful of Grant, Butcher Grant, as his men call him. He's been foiled north of the James River by Lee, of course. She just thought Grant was going nowhere against Lee, and she loved to pick up that theme and continue it in her diary. Confederate accounts often grossly underestimated Lee's losses, interestingly, and inflated Union casualties. I'll quote John Beecham Jones, the famous rebel war clerk in Richmond, who wrote in his diary on June 15, 1864, "Grant has used up nearly 100,000 men. To what purpose? Our army is intact. Lee's losses altogether in killed and wounded, not exceeding a few thousand, says John B. Jones. Walter Taylor, who may have related ideas prevalent at Lee's headquarters, there's always that sense with him. He's so close to Lee that when he writes, his letters have been published. I recommend them to you very highly if you want a great set of letters that give you insights to Confederate Army headquarters. He was afraid that things were going too well, Walter Taylor was. He thinks our great danger is that we may become too self-reliant and boastful. The Army's in excellent trim, even in fine spirits, and ready for a renewal of the fight whenever the signal is given. Member of the 11th North Carolina Infantry in Harry Heath's division of the 3rd Corps wrote right after Spotsylvania, "Grant is twice as badly whipped now as was Burnside or Hooker, but he's so determined he will not acknowledge it. But I think before he gets through with Lee, he'll have to own up." great confidence in the Army of Northern Virginia. Some Confederates even, instead of thinking that Lee was losing too many men, maybe should be a little more careful on the defensive, a number urged more aggressive tactics. I find this kind of remarkable. John Gregg, who commanded the Texas Brigade, wrote, "The strength of the Army has been husbanded in a manner which would astonish the oldest soldier. I think by losing greatly more and taking the offensive, General Lee might have put Grant to flight before this." And Colonel Thomas H. Carter, who's one of the best artillerists in the Second Corps, cheerfully noted that Grant's army had lost 50,000 troops since the campaign opened, but he groused about the fact that, quote, "General Lee talks of fighting another defensive battle. We will never do anything with Grant until we attack him." The prospect of assuming the offensive animated officers all the way down the ranks. It's not just colonels of artillery and generals heading brigades that are talking this way. A man named Edgeworth Byrd, his letters have been published. They're very good. He was in Henry Benning's brigade. "Lee's army is now greatly strengthened," he wrote on June 1st, "and it's probable we will resume the offensive," which he wanted to do. I'll stop in this little period with Gabriel C. Wharton, who developed themes widely repeated in other Confederate sources. I'm using him because he was a brigade commander in John C. Breckinridge's division, and I wanted to mention John C. Breckinridge while I'm in Lexington, and now I have. Breckinridge's division had reinforced Lee's army just before Cold Harbor, and he wrote frequent letters to his wife, which my friend and many of our friends, many of you know who Jack Davis is. Jack has just finished editing Gabriel Wharton's letters, which University of North Carolina Press is publishing. They're absolutely splendid letters. I had a student in my Civil War class at UVA a few years ago, and she came up after class one day and said, "Are you ever interested in looking at Civil War letters?" And I've had so many lousy Civil War letters brought up to me that I just go, "Yeah, I really like to look at Civil War letters." And she said, "Well, my family has some." And I said, "Really? Who's your family?" And she said, "Have you ever heard of General Wharton?" And I said, "Gabriel Wharton?" She said, "Yeah, we have about 1,000 of his letters." My mom doesn't know what to do with them, and I wonder if you'd talk to her. Those letters are coming out from UNC Press, and they are really good. His letters to his wife accentuate Lee's dominance on recent battlefields, the gruesome Union losses, high Confederate morale, and the deteriorating political and economic conditions in the North. The easy repulse of the Federal assaults on June 3rd at Cold Harbor, according to Wharton, leave Grant, quote, "in no condition to attack again for a week or more." He wanted Lee to assume a counteroffensive pose at this. "General Lee will pitch into him as soon as the proper occasion arises." More aggressive, more offensive is what Gabriel Wharton wanted. The vital connection between Lee's operations and the presidential canvass unfolding in the United States resonated in the Confederacy. We always need to keep in mind when we look at military events unfolding in 1864 that from a very early part of that year, they've circled November 1864 on their calendars, and they know that what happens when people cast ballots in the United States is going to have tremendous consequences in the Confederacy. If somehow the Democrats can win, that's really good for the Confederacy. Anything that's bad for the Republicans is good for the Confederacy, and they are watching, and they think that what Lee is doing with Grant is going to be good for the Confederacy in the autumn. I'll quote another really good diarist, Mary Greenough Lee of Winchester, Virginia, who linked the election and the Overland campaign in her diary on June 17th. She said, "I doubt not Lee is prepared to checkmate Grant speedily. Whatever Grant does, Lee is going to handle him. Meanwhile, with political dissensions at the North becoming more violent each day," she wrote, "and opposition to Lincoln being so great, it seems probable all factions will unite at the Chicago Convention and present a formidable rival." And she mentioned McClellan as one of those potentially formidable rivals. Well, in the United States, as I said, some newspapers also praised Lee. I'll just give you a couple because I think this is unusual and there's nothing comparable to it in the Confederacy about Grant. I'll quote 3 examples, one Democratic, 2 Republican, that underscore the degree to which the rebel chieftain continued to bedevil the Northern psyche. On June 12th, the New York Herald referred to, quote, the great army of the Confederacy, which under Lee's guidance certainly presented to the world a rare instance of human genius, but then finishes, accomplishing much in a bad cause. He's a genius. He's a genius on the wrong side. New York Times sought to explain the absence of a decisive federal victory in Virginia in part because, quote, Lee's army is an army of veterans. It is an instrument sharpened to a perfect edge. And in Chicago, the main paper added a Western voice to this chorus. Lee is a tough customer, physically and in a military sense. It's a pity that so much tenacity and power should be exerted in so bad a cause. We hope it's destined to give way sooner or later. Again, there's nothing comparable to that in the Confederate press saying, yeah, Grant's a good general. No, they concede nothing in that regard. The British loved Lee, loved him. The Illustrated London News, by far the most widely distributed British periodical, its sales were 300,000 a week, featured a full-length portrait of Lee on its front page during the first week of June and a long accompanying article about the rebel chieftain. It pronounced Lee, quote, one of the greatest soldiers of this age, who has shown his consummate mastery of the art of war during 3 years of campaigning. It noted that he was connected by marriage to George Washington, so here the Brits are connecting Lee to George Washington. He says, Lee is trusted by his government, has the hearts of his soldiers, and possesses the entire confidence of the country. All Confederates rely implicitly upon his patriotism and his genius. And then it went on to say that not since the Duke of Wellington, Napoleon, had strutted on the early 19th century martial stage had the world witnessed, quote, in high perfection, the peculiar combination of moral and intellectual qualities which fits a man for military command. Just over the top on Lee. I was going to quote the French. I don't have a watch up here. I need to know what time it is, someone, please. Because I can get carried away and I don't want to. How are we doing on time? It's 6:30? Are you on mountain time? What time is it? 7:40, okay. All right, I'm going to press forward. I am going to quote, okay, I'm going to quote from London. From Paris. I was going to cut it. Parisians could also form impressions of Lee through they had 13 newspapers in the capital in Paris. One was Le Temps, the Times, an Orleanist newspaper. It had a pro-Union slant, but it also said very nice things about R.E. Lee, described him as a very remarkable man of war and a general-in-chief of remarkable talent whose victories showcased the courage and energy of the Confederate troops. The stalemate between Grant and Lee, which was described in one way or another by a number of newspapers, affected the two nations as well as the two commanders in very different ways. I hope that's coming through as one of my themes. The summer deepened into August. Morale eroded significantly in the United States. The lowest point of the war for the United States is July and August 1864. Everybody who thinks Gettysburg is the great turning point, really, for goodness sake, get over it. It's not. The darkest moment of the war for the United States is right here after the Overland campaign. It's a summer in which it seemed that a season of campaigning that had begun with so much promise when Grant took the field had come to nothing in this unbelievable cascade of blood during the Overland campaign. Abraham Lincoln, as we all know, passed a blind memorandum around his cabinet on August the 23rd and had them all sign it, in which he said it is exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. We have to win the war before the Democrats take office next year. The Republicans didn't even call themselves Republicans in the election of 1864. They called themselves the Union Party because they hoped that would be a better way to try to bring in votes, including some Democrats. And in fact, had the Republicans depended entirely on Grant's efforts against Lee, Lincoln almost certainly would not have been reelected. It's two other components of Grant's overall strategy that reelected Lincoln and the Republicans. It's William Tecumseh Sherman in Georgia, and it's Philip Henry Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley. that reelect the Republicans and make sure the war will be carried on. Had it just been Grant versus Lee, almost certainly would not have happened. Now, Grant remained unchallenged as the Union's preeminent soldier in the wake of the Overland campaign. Of course he did, and went on to, in the end, defeat Lee decisively. But his reputation did lose some luster as a result of what had gone on here. He'd pummeled the rebels, pinned their best army down, and denied Lee the opportunities for maneuver that had paid such dividends for the Confederates in 1862 and 1863. All those are very important things, but what hadn't he done? He hadn't beaten Lee decisively in one battle, and he hadn't captured Richmond. And those are the two things that the loyal citizenry wanted above all when this campaign began. And moreover, the failure to accomplish those two things had come at this incredible cost of Union manpower, which made it all the worse. And that was a dimension of the operations that the Copperheads exploited relentlessly. At the war's end, Grant stood alongside Lincoln as a co-equal savior of the Republic, truly co-equal. Lincoln's assassination gives him, of course, he's a martyr in that regard, but we've lost a sense of how towering a figure U.S. Grant was at the end of the Civil War. But he never entirely escaped the shadow into which peace Democrats and Confederates assiduously labored to cast him as a result of the Overland campaign. This label of Grant the Butcher stuck with Grant. More than 90 years after Cold Harbor, Winston Churchill echoed the unsparing critiques of the late spring and early summer of 1864. Britain's redoubtable war leader remarked in his History of the English-Speaking Peoples that, quote, Grant's tactics of unflinching butchery, although they eventually gained their purpose, must be regarded as the negation of generalship. That is Churchill on U.S. Grant. Churchill on Grant. Well, no diminution of reputation plagued Lee in the wake of the Overland campaign. If anything, he emerged with more impressive support among fellow countrymen and women. As in the United States, Confederates focused on the fact that Richmond didn't fall and remained a rebel city and very well defended by the Army of Northern Virginia. Vexed by no political faction resembling the Copperheads who yapped at Grant's heels, Lee inspired, as I've said, an almost universal admiration that also strengthened resolve not to capitulate to or even negotiate with the Federals. Like George Washington, he seemed to many Confederates a good candidate to combine military and at least a measure of political power. And I will quote Colonel William Ransom Johnson Pegram, Willie Pegram here, a young artillerist in A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps, who assured one of his sisters in Richmond in September, all will be well if the president will only give everything into General Lee's hands. All over the Confederacy, people, newspapers, private people begin talking about making Lee a dictator, and they use the word dictator. Lee should be made a dictator. We can trust him. Why can we trust him? Because he's like Washington. We can give him all the power, he'll give it back when we have achieved independence. Another way in which they yoke him to Washington. On June 5th and 6th, 1864, George Gordon Meade wrote 2 letters that encapsulate what happened to Grant and Lee during the Overland campaign. The Army of the Potomac had compelled Lee, he said, quote, to draw in toward Richmond, but failed to overcome, destroy, or bag his army. With a tinge of satisfaction rooted in a painful history of campaigns against the Army in Northern Virginia, Meade continued, quote, I think Grant has had his eyes opened and is willing to admit now that Virginia and Lee's army is not Tennessee and Bragg's army. That is the definition of understatement. If you want to see it somewhere, Google understatement. It should have that quotation. Lee's army is not Bragg's army. But Union prospects, said Meade, remained encouraging. Lee and his army did benefit from what he called advantages of position, fortifications, and being concentrated at their center, which meant Grant and the Union army would have to move slowly and cautiously, but I am in hopes with reasonable luck we shall be able to succeed. That is just, Meade is right on target there. Meade's letters get at why Grant's reputation slipped a little bit, why Lee's did not, and how popular perceptions often differed from military reality. Reality eventually would be complete success for Grant and utter unequivocal failure for Lee. But the road to that end, the road to Wilmer McLean's parlor, was far from clear to people in the United States and the Confederacy in August of 1864. That road would be longer and more winding than Meade or most others could envision. Thank you.